I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Those were the words of Prime Minister Chamberlain. This broadcast was made on September 3rd, 1939. I still get chills whenever I hear this speech, the terror created among millions across the world. Everyone knew what the Nazis were capable of doing, and it became very apparent very early on that this Second World War would be nothing like the first. There's an old saying I've heard on many occasions: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. If I were to pick one word to describe the opening months of the Second World War, it would be intensive. Between September 1939 and May 1940, the Nazis would forge from one victory to another. It was during this period that Operation Dynamo was created, where from the beaches of Dunkirk, north of France, more than 338,000 Allied servicemen were evacuated to England, aboard as many fleets of ships as they could. This was seen as an inspiring victory by the media, as the event motivated the nation to properly assemble itself for war. Winston Churchill, who was the current server of the Conservative Prime Minister, became head of the wartime coalition government, and he was quick to assemble a number of ministers who began the production of aircraft, coal, and other supplies needed for battle. On June 2nd, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany, submitting the country to an occupation. With this conquest, the Nazis began positioning large numbers of warcraft, such as planes and several munitions, across numerous borders. Seemingly anticipating this would happen, the War Department had secretly put forth Operation Chariot. This was a British amphibious attack on the heavily defended Normandy dry dock at Saint-Nazaire in German-occupied France. This operation was undertaken by the Royal Navy and British commandos under the auspices of Combined Operations Headquarters. Railways across the network of Britain would be used during this period to evacuate civilian populations from major cities to the countryside. Although the War Department had assigned a sizable number of locomotives to the job, other volunteers were called in to assist, just in the case of the event that the number wasn't enough. Of the 612 men who undertook the raid, 228 returned to Britain, 169 were killed, and 215 became prisoners of war. All along the coast, towns and cities were bombed in lightning-fast raids, all in an effort to gauge the response time of the Royal Air Force. What was seen here was merely a preview to a much larger campaign that was slowly being prepared. This was the Battle of Britain. Depending on your choice of perspective, the Battle of Britain was either a single campaign or two separate ones that lasted from July 1940 to June 1941. This was the first time in history where all the fighting took place in the air. The objectives of the Blitz were split into two. 1. Soften the nation up for a possible invasion, and 2. Break its morale. The Nazis figured that under the weight of the level of attacks, Britain would eventually declare defeat and surrender to fascist rule. I'm pleased to say their gamble failed, and Great Britain would maintain its triumphant stance, albeit at a terrible price. Thousands of planes fought in the skies above, with many pilots perishing and surviving, and many more dying on the ground below. This ravaged many parts of the country, with more than a dozen towns and cities being affected by the number of air raids. Of all these locations, London was easily the hardest hit. German bombers dropped 711 tons of high-explosive bombs and 2,393 fires all over the capital. 1,436 civilians were killed. However, this proved to be the last major raid until 1943. A few days later, the Battle of Britain was officially declared over, with Britain emerging victorious. I would say that the soldiers involved in the Air Force were responsible for this victory, but that wasn't entirely the case. You see, the frequency of the air raids coincided with the newly put forth Operation Barbarossa, in which the Nazis would launch a massive invasion of Russia, breaking their hold of the motherland. Later that year, two more great powers would come to blows, and the fighting would continue to extend further into the Pacific. There's sort of an unwritten rule when it comes to war, which is win by any means necessary, no matter the cost. Victory is key, and it's through strength of arms that it is often seen as the more honorable tactic. A lesser-known fact about America's involvement in World War II is that in a technical sense, it had been part of the conflict since before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The Lend-Lease Act, which was signed on March 11th of that year, enabled the United States to transfer arms and other materials to any nation it deemed was essential to its own defense. Britain had been among the handful of countries to receive such aid in the form of weapons, coal, iron, and other goods. And after Pearl Harbor, braving the German U-boats as best as they could, vast amounts of ships across the Atlantic to deliver needed supplies to Britain. Of course, this wasn't carried out purely for the sake of comfort. It was intended to increase the overall efficiency of the war effort. And indeed, the time was fast approaching where people would make a substantial contribution to it. This would come to play when the North African Campaign was formed, which took place on the front lines of Africa, which already got its start on June 10, 1940, and would eventually end on May 13, 1943. This was fought between the Allies and the Axis powers. The primary combatants were British forces, including Indian and African soldiers, against the Axis powers, mainly consisting of Italian and German troops. Erwin Rommel was the field marshal, nicknamed the Desert Fox, and from there, brutal battles were fought between the two powers, culminating in the siege of Stalingrad, one of the most significant events in which the surrender of German Field Marshal Paulus and his army to the Soviet Union on January 31st took place, marking a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. In addition, the Casablanca Conference took place between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, where they declared their demand for an unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. This put Rommel's forces on the run, and throughout 1943, the Allies would chase them across North Africa. This was the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime, but I'm sorry to say, they still had plenty of fight left in them. By 1944, the Allies had liberated a majority of Axis territories occupied during the war. In early 1945, Allied troops entered Germany, and by mid-April of that year, the Battle of the Bulge had been fought. The effort by the Germans to turn the tide of the war had failed, and now they were well and truly facing defeat as Allied forces began closing in on Berlin. World War II officially came to an end when Germany faced their defeat and signed a surrender at the headquarters of the U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well as a second document declaring surrender in Berlin, which was enacted on May 7, 1945, and declared official on May 8. Churchill announced victory over the continent, a victory that ended the war in Europe. Japan, however, persisted. In a desperate bid to end this 6-year battle in an efficient and quick manner, the current United States President Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs on Japan, with 2 being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August respectively. The devastation and destruction that followed led to the eventual surrender of the Japanese, and on September 2nd, 1945, the Second World War was finally put to an end. The Second World War was and still remains one of, if not the most devastating conflict in history. Very few nations were spared its wrath, and fewer still escaped the many battles and committed atrocities. Millions died, and millions more were left homeless. I really can't stress how bleak this period was. Its hardships were bad enough, but the real inevitable tragedy was not everyone lived to see its end. And those who did should be very, very thankful for that. This has been my discussion of World War II.